Hello, this is Aaron Klein. I know it's only been a couple days, but I'm going to try to upload more often. These are some of my thoughts. Um, and interestingly enough, I've been more theological lately, and not theosophical. And what I mean by that is, I'm not trying. I know I said I was trying to recreate Christianity. Um, I don't know about that. I think I'm just. I think once you identify the through lines, you can start to play with them and get similar tones. It's like, how do I put this? I think a lot of the strains of Christianity that are out there are trying to play with. They're trying to create different songs using the same stringed instrument, the same narrative. And I actually do think narrative is like a string. And the accumulation of narratives that are within the Bible allow you to play different genres of songs. I think that's a really important idea. And I'm going to leave that idea for a little bit. Today I want to talk about, I want to approach the nature of God. And it's nice that I can just pause, because I want to identify who God is to me. Because not everyone knows it's going to resonate with a lot of people, because it's a very strong underpinning idea. And I'm using that underpinning word specifically. I'm using that word specifically. And it's something that atheists can't really battle very well. And it actually starts a little bit later than Genesis. And why I say that is, I think Genesis uses people and uses the avatar of God as pawns. I think, how do I put this? I think that Genesis is probably, even though the events metaphysically happened, like there was definitely a flood, and there was probably a Tower of Babel. And in fact, the Tower of Babel didn't have to physically exist. They tried to create a hierarchy within people, and it got too big and it just collapsed, because they were trying to approach the all power of God. In fact, if you look at if you just start looking at the words and start to constructively criticize the story, you can start to piece that together. Now, obviously, I do believe there was a flood, because I live in Indiana and we have limestone. And if you can explain any other way how that happened other than a worldwide flood, be my guest. On the flip side, I think that those ideas don't approach God. I think they approach, I don't think they're approaching they're approaching an aspect of God, but I don't think they approach a way to describe God. I think they are pieces within a plot used to explain an underpinning idea that God is trying to give us. As to this is sort of a Petersonian idea, but it's not entirely, because I disagree with him a little bit. But there's this idea that Genesis is about the awakening of consciousness within humans. And one part I disagree with is, I think we were created. I think metaphysically and physically, we were created a couple million years ago, and someone used that. I think it was, how do I put this? It's not just a plot element. I'll leave it at that. It's not just a plot element that we were created. But in God doing so, he also gave us a plot element. I think that's a good way to put it. I think that God is I am that I am, that we find in Exodus 3. And why do I use that name? Why do I use that name instead of Jehovah? Now, obviously, I'm not going to use Yahweh. I'm pretty sure that the Jews intentionally obscured the name of God once they started holding the name of God sacred. So sacred that it was taboo to say it aloud and to record it. And they have to go through purification rituals to be able to express it to people outside of the secrecy cult within Judaism, because a lot of religions actually have a secrecy part to them. Like that's why the name of God. Like I think that's the answer to why Christians worship him as Jehovah, and the Jews are willing to call him Yahweh. And I'm not going down that path any farther, but I think that's true. But I think I'm going to call him I am that I am. And a piece of that is that's what he calls himself in Exodus 3. But he doesn't just call himself that in Exodus 3. He calls him that to Elijah and Elisha and Eli, and he calls himself that as Christ when he was walking on the water in the Gospels, and many more times in the Gospels. And the fact that I used that name really made the aristocratic Jews very angry, because that's an undeniable call to being God. It's not like he was calling himself Jehovah. He was actually calling himself Yeshua, which is Jehovah saves. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that name is a derivative of Elishua or Elisha, the spiritual son of Elijah. I don't know why he was called Joshua. If you don't understand why I'm saying it that way, the original Jewish uses a Y there because they didn't have a J. And to me, the original, I like the way that sounds too. And also part of me doesn't like the name Joshua. I don't like using that name because I've met enough Joshes around that are kind of weak, and that's not Jesus. But also, I think it's a beautiful language. I know, like, how do I put this? I don't like Jewish practices because we're called to something higher than they are, and they aren't willing to meet us there. But I do like the way they treat names and the language that is used within and around them. So like I'm like with that understanding, this is something that happened recently. I'm finally okay with being called Aaron Christopher. So anyways, the reason why I like to use the name I am that I am, a lot of it has to do with the symbolism, but a lot of it also has to do with the fact that when I was writing my book, it dawned on me, and I mean dawned very literally, within the context of the book, it really makes sense. um, it really dawned on me that um, when my character, like, when I write my book, I have to let the book write through me. I have to let the story tell itself, just like I have to let the story tell itself through the character, through the main character. But it literally dawned on the main character as it dawned through me that God is the metaconsciousness that wove together reality. And I mean wove together pretty literally there. I think God created a structure for us to be able to live stories within. And to be able to weave stories together to make our own. Now, why does all that seem weird? And what I mean by this, by the metaconsciousness that wove this world together, so that way we could weave our own stories. There's a piece of this where you have to understand that once you become an author and you're telling a story, a part of you is within that book. To say that God is within everything is not to say that you could go touch grass and you're touching God, which that's kind of funny. But like, you could in theory say that you can go look at the sun and say, I'm looking at God and he hasn't killed me. That's kind of funny, but there's this flip side where it's in the way Tolkien, like, the way Tolkien writes, you can tell it's him in Lord of the Rings. Even though the characters never question God, the world imitates, the ethics of the world imitates his own ethics that he's woven into the story. And it's not just that the characters and the features within the story imitate his worldview. Not imitate, they embody the inner workings of his mind. And actually, when I'm writing my book, that's a lot of the monsters and spiritual creatures that I make, the ones that kind of mess between the spiritual and the creature, the monsters. So, like, I have a Hydra that you can only kill in the shadows, because the head that is mortal within it, like the mortal head of the Hydra, you can only interact with it in the darkness. That's one of my monsters. Another one is I have a couple, but another one's like it's a harpy, and how do I put this? It's very different from the harpies of Greek. Like, it's similar to the harpies of Greek mythology, but it has my twist on it. And there's a couple monsters here and there that have my twist on them. And when you start to approach it from that direction, you could say that this world is created by the metaconsciousness that we call God. And in fact, I actually allude to this in chapter 8. No, not chapter 8, chapter 10. I'm finishing up chapter 10 right now, which is sort of where this started from. This is where this idea that I wanted to talk about started from. There's this idea that God is the metaconsciousness that underpins all of creation. And in chapter 12, when I actually let him meet God, I don't even let, like, how do I put this? He doesn't physically meet God. Like, there's no way on earth he physically meets God. In a metaphysical sense, in a dreamlike state, coming back to reality from Hades after he passes through the metaphysical night of the domain of Nyx. That's a whole different story. But once he passes through that, and if you read it, there's a lot of mystical, dreamlike stuff that's in it, but it makes sense because you're not even suspending your own disbelief. Once you are walking in the story, it makes sense. And I didn't intend for it to make sense this way, but when you're at the end of the night, when day rises, that's when he meets God, and that's sort of like the awakening of consciousness. Sort of. That's not everything that's in there. It's so packed for a book that's going to be less than 150,000 words, or maybe right around 150,000 words. It is one of the most compact things I've ever written, and I love it. But when he meets the metaconsciousness, I let it call itself I am. Because that's when it dawns on my character that this thing it doesn't have bounds. But it needs us to, because we're bounded, it needs us to write its stories for it. Something like that. It gave us a world to live and to write stories within. And and if you know anything about current psychological research, we actually see objects as tools first, and we process how useful, and we actually process the use of the object as a story element, as a tool within that story, and we actually prioritize within story using story elements, and we actually live in an ever persisting story until the day we die, and that's when our story ends. And in fact, it doesn't even end there, because oftentimes people's stories will live on a little bit longer after they die. It's like, for example, we all know who Einstein is. He's one of the greatest physicists that walked this planet, and I think I'm going to paraphrase his quote. He doesn't believe in a Christian God. I think he said something along the lines of, I don't believe in any of the prescribed gods, but I know one exists. Something like that. I think we're all trying to intimate God, but I think the closest understanding we have of him right now is that he's a metaconsciousness without limitations, and that's his only limitation. He has no limitations other than the fact that because he has no limitations, he can't tell stories. It's a Superman issue. It's a Superman complex. Once you lose all your limitations, stories don't work, because you have no obstacles that you can't overcome, that you don't struggle to do anything. I know this isn't, I can't stop it here because I think I'm missing a piece here. Why is he the metaconsciousness? Like, I get, he is I am that I am, because he is the ultimate being that says I exist. Something like that. He's the ultimate existence. Something like that. If you read the original Hebrew in chapter 3 of Exodus, in verse 14, I was studying this, so I know it's verse 14 where he says it. It's something like, there's a possession there. There's a possession in some sort. like he owns himself, something like that. I exist that I exist. And that's what it means to be an ultimate form of existence, something like that. And the reason why that's so important later on in the Gospels is it's an easy statement that, like, it's a short statement. It's concise. They're not going, like, if you answer, I'm Jehovah, like, there's a lot more to argue with that. Like, they'll probably call you, like, how do I put this? To say I am that I am means that you are aware of what you're saying. If you say you're Jehovah, you could, in theory, just not know what you're saying, but to say that I am that I am, it means that you're using a wordplay specifically to illustrate that you know exactly what you're saying and you know who you are. I think that may be the end of the idea. But I'm going to work with this from now on. So for those of you who will tune into this, I won't be using the name Jehovah. I will be using the name I am. And I think that's probably the way the Jews... They may have just used the word El, meaning God. They probably just used El. So, like, Bethel is house of God. If you remember in Genesis, like, Bethel is a place that Abraham established. He established an altar there and named it Bethel. There's a couple of instances where El comes up. El just means God. And actually, back before Babylonian captivity, there was a period when the Jews were monologists. They started as polytheists and they were monologists, which means they accepted that there were other gods, but they only worshipped the one. Accepted that there was one God. And why is that important to this conversation? Because you have to understand how how the perception of gods and God were evolved. And I'm going to use evolved, and I think it works. I think the word evolved works. Just like how you can, as you propagate a text, it loses some things, and it gains other things, and you can make it more concise. The text itself evolved. That's a Jordan Peterson idea, and I think I sort of like it. I'm not sure if I 100% agree with it, but I think it's a good start, because I think, like, the story of Cain and Abel probably started out much bigger, and as they slowly chopped it down, it became more and more accurate. They got rid of the frivolous things, and like, they may have lost some of the important things, but because it got so concise, they were allowed to make it extremely potent with how small it was. And that sort of shows you an idea of evolution of story. You can make it as concise as you need to, and at some point it's extremely dense. Where was I going with that? Anyways, oh yeah, I think that those sort of probably mirror the multiple interpretations of text can be cut down to a very dense version of a text, which will account for those. But with doing that, you probably also have to eliminate enough of the story elements that certain ones of them are eventually forgotten. And in doing so, when it originates in a polytheistic framework, eventually you just figure out that certain gods aren't necessary for the plot of the story to continue. And also another interesting idea based on that line is, and it poses a really interesting question. The book of Job, which I think should be the second book, or maybe the fifth book, because the first four are extremely religious and extremely tightly knit together, and would I understand why Jews wouldn't want Job to be book number 2, but I'm willing to put it as book 2 or book 5. I think it should be moved up. It's one of the oldest books. The entire book, what I'm saying there, it's not one of the oldest writings. There is a battle song. I think there's a battle song in Judges that is the oldest writing of Judaism that survived. But the oldest book, I think, is Job. The entire book of Job is the oldest that we've been able to track down. And I know this for certain. The devil was, or Satan, how I put it that way. Satan was added as a story piece by the Jews at some point, because the book didn't make a whole lot of sense without it at the time, without Satan being around. And nowadays, I think we could probably use an older version and drop Satan from it. Or at least those of us who are interested in it. Those of us who want to analyze it. Not just for a critique to tear it down, but for a constructive critique. So that way we could disassemble it, evaluate it, and put it back together the way it was supposed to be, or even better. And in fact, we could retell it in a more nuanced sense and expand on it. That's sort of the way you should start evaluating most stories in the Bible, actually. You should be willing to constructively critique them, and to be able to elaborate on the story elements that are involved. I remember where I was going. So the reason why, this is the last part that I forgot. The biggest reason why I claim that I'm going to use the name of God as I am, and why he's a metaconsciousness, is the actual context from the stories the two big stories that I claimed to get the name from when I started this video. The burning bush of Exodus 3. I think it was 1 Kings for Elijah's interaction with God. And I think they both completely overlap perfectly, but there's two symbols there that both represent the great I am. One is the unconsumptive fire of the burning bush. And the way I've orchestrated that, I wouldn't say orchestrated, the way I've expressed that idea is a white flame, a spectral white flame around the object. And the other is the still small voice. And it's not in the earthquakes, or the rushing wind, or the floods, or the lightning and thunder, but the still small voice in the dead silence. There's this piece of calling that comes from your consciousness sometimes. And sometimes it's subtle. And usually it is just subtle, but sometimes when you're quiet, you just wait. You can ask a question and just wait, and this is part of what Jordan Peterson was expressing when he did his first lectures on Genesis. When he, at the beginning of it, said, well, hopefully we'll get through the whole Bible. he barely got through Genesis. Like, it was that, like, that should tell you how dense the Bible is. That he thought he might get through the whole Bible in a 12-week period, and he only got through Genesis. And then that's what the most recent book he wrote is about, Genesis, on we who wrestle with God. And actually that sort of plays into it. But there's this idea, and I've felt this, and I think, how do I put this? That white flame is, to equate that white flame with the word is something special to be able to do that. And I think this is what Catholicism did, and I actually agree with them on this. There's not a whole lot I'm going to agree with Catholics on, but the word as fire, but not just as fire, as the unconsuming fire. The truth as the unconsuming fire of God. That is something I will die on. I didn't like the idea at first, but now I actually really, really like it. And one of the reasons why you can make the connection is in Acts 3. I'm pretty sure it's Acts 3, which is kind of funny. And I think that maps directly onto Exodus 3. Like, they both have a very similar meaning. They both have a very similar, like, if you can consider the gospel accounts as equivalent to the Genesis account, like, if those 4 books map onto Genesis as like an introduction to the idea and to live it out, then Acts would be to Exodus as the disciples leading the Gentiles and the Jews out of the law, maps directly onto leading the slaves out of Egypt. And for any of you atheists that say, but there's no record of slaves in Egypt, what do you get paid in? Money? No. You don't get paid in money anymore. None of us. It's all phony. We're all slaves. We're all slaves to our government. We're all living in Egypt right now. Like, if you can't see that, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Like, metaphysically, we're in Egypt, and we need a Moses to lead us out. I don't know if I am. I do not think I am. And it's funny that I'm using I am there, right? I'm not going down that road. Like, that language got woven into the English language super easily. I don't know how or why. But, anyways, back to the topic. The tongues of fire over the disciples' heads that went out and preached to the populace. I'm actually more interested in the idea. There's a different idea here. It's not just that they were able to speak the language of the people that they were talking to. That would have been one thing. I think the message that they were able to speak was to the soul of each and every individual person. I don't think this idea of speaking in tongues that is rampant among certain sects of Christianity, I think that's wrong. I think that I'm calling it a white flame. That's the way I imagine it, because it directly maps onto a yin-yang kind of thing. I will explain that right after this. I think the tongues of fire that were over the disciples' heads was a symbol that they were from God, and that each and every one of them were speaking to the souls of the people that they were encountering. That's why they were so effective to speak, so effective at converting. And it was in Jerusalem, and you want to know what method they had to have used at the time? There's no way they could have done it rhetorically. There's no way you can go from from facts to God is real. And I've hit this wall when I was younger. About 5 years ago, I tried to do this with one of my friends, and it didn't work. Obviously, like don't try to prove that God is real through some sort of argumentation. But you want to know what they did use? They used story. They used their own story encounters with God as Jesus. They had to have. There's no way. Like no one's talking about that, but they had to have used some sort of compelling language. I think they told the stories that they lived through to the people that were around them. There were definitely Jews, and there were definitely Greeks and Romans, and these people would have had the ability to talk directly to those people in their native language and to speak from their own hearts the stories of the great I Am, how Emmanuel walked on this earth, right? God is with us. That is Emmanuel. How Jesus walked on this earth. There's no way you can convince someone through rhetoric. I've learned that. Don't try convincing people through rhetoric. You can only convince them through story. That's why on those what is it? The ESPA, I think it is, those commercials with the sad puppy dogs. They pull at your heartstrings. There's a reason why they use that instead of numbers. Because most people don't, how do I put this? The gospel isn't built for people who are built, like it's not, the method that the gospel uses to convert is through story, because it's not built on numbers, it's built on experiences. Because you're not going to be able to give a compelling story without experiencing it, or at least experiencing in pieces of it enough that you can tell it as though it were true. I know that's like really dancing around me saying these people experienced it, so they just told what they experienced, but they could at least intimate it, because actually our brains aren't even computer-like machinery for information storage. They are actually, like, that's not enough. The amount of computing power to be able to categorize and the amount of meaning making our brains have to do already, our brains literally have to process it all through emotion and through tools and meaning. Like, there's a whole layer between us and reality that no one's, like, if you look at the literature, you can understand there's a layer between us and reality. That's our perception. And it's through stories and elements within them, and through tools, and through obstacles or challenges, right? Something like that. There's a layer between us and reality, and scientists are just trying to push through that. They're trying to push through the opposite veil of what I'm trying to do. And that's sort of because, like, I've been through that. I've pushed through that veil, just empirical. The empirical isn't enough. The empirical was never enough. The empirical is valuable. And, like, everything the empirical says is fact. And technically facts are true, but so are too technically stories that are your worldview. It's why personally I don't think atheism has a valid argument, because it can't make a valid argument, because it doesn't, it can't recognize that stories are more valuable than raw fact data. Like, internally, our brains hold stories more valuable than raw fact data, which is why some stories, even if they're not physically true, have more meaning to us than the fact that the sun burns at X degrees heat, and because it's made up of a bunch of nuclear explosions, right? Something like that. The Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world, even they have to paint a story with the data. So I think atheists can't actually make any of the arguments unless they start through a religious framework. And the fact that they hold the truth as sacred, as holy, means that they have a Christian underpinning, because you aren't going to find a whole bunch of you're not going to find a whole bunch of scientists coming out of any of the religions that don't hold the truth as holy, as divine. And in fact, like as part of Christianity, we believe that that the calling of God is to seek the truth, to seek God, because it is divine, and in doing so, that is the start. That is the start of your adventure. That sets up the light that you're chasing through an adventure. That sets up the chord. You can think of where you are starting from at now, and the light of your calling, that is the burning bush in Exodus 3. That's the same calling as, like, that burning bush is a calling. The line that you can't see but you follow to get there, that is an adventure. That's a calling that God is putting you up to. And that's sort of where I am at the moment. That's why I'm so dead set on finishing my book, because I have this calling. I see that burning bush. In fact, that's part of chapter 10, sort of. This burning bush is a feature of God, in as much as the same way as the truth is a feature of God. And actually, I'm gonna take a short. I'm gonna end on a parallel idea, and this is sort of gonna tie directly back into the previous little ramble. Not ramble. The discussion I had. I don't know if lecture, discussion, whatever I'm gonna call it. It's going to lead back into that. The idea, and this is actually where I sort of have gotten the idea from my background. You're going to it's all going to work together, I trust. Well, trust me. This idea of yin and yang. There's the burning bush in the cave of potential and danger. And then there is the dark. There's a piece. How do I put this? There's a piece of the sacred in the unexplored, dangerous, yet potential-filled darkness in the darker part of the yin yang symbol. I don't know which one goes where. And then the other one is there is a piece of us in the divine. And in fact, you can actually use that as, but it's not just that. There's also part of me that thinks that we stand in the center of that. And we can choose, we can choose to find the worst parts of the world, even in a society as great as ours, which is part of what's been going on. And we can choose to seek out a greater calling. I don't know why there's darkness in the light too. Actually, like that, I'm not very well versed at, so I'm intimating on that, but I'm pretty sure the light in the darkness there is this idea of the burning bush that Moses is called to. I think it's Moses. Yeah, that Moses is called to in Exodus 3. I think that's the exact same idea. This idea that when you get a calling, you follow it. This isn't just like an Abrahamic calling by God, which it sort of is. In fact, it's almost an identical. I think those two stories overlap pretty well. Abraham is called out of his paradise. He's an eternal boy. He's called out of his paradise to go on a heroic adventure by God. I think this may be like the light going into the darkness. You have to. Paradise isn't enough. You actually have to seek out the adventure. And while that, life may be meaningless in that sense, life could also be meaningless in it's dark and nothing is meaningful. I'm going to, how do I put it? Well, pause. I'm going to finish up my idea. I bet the story of Abraham and the story of Moses are meant to overlap pretty strongly. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're dialogically imposed in a mirror-like setting, like the yin and yang symbol. One is to lead people out of shackles, the shackles of slavery, and one is to lead the individual out of the shackles of utopia. And this may be that calling of Dostoevsky. I think it's Dostoevsky saying that humans are exactly the kind of creatures that, even if they were left to be in blissful paradise and just left to procreate, they'd eventually start breaking things because it's too boring. I think that's part of the idea. I think that may actually be part of the idea of a mirrored dialogue, where it's one, they're both called to adventures, I think. And the reason why that is, why the yin-yang symbol is sort of important to me is because I think humans have been using, in our dream-like callings like this, we've found incredibly powerful symbols like this. Now the Chinese, I have no idea what they originally used it for, but I think I'm going to end up using it to mean a dialogical pair of stories. And this is sort of actually, food for thought. This probably also ties directly back into my last video. I think Evangelion, Neon Genesis Evangelion, and Gurren Lagann are in the same boat right here. I think they probably actually map on to Abraham and Moses. No, I don't know. I think Abraham and Moses do map on directly to each other. And I think it's powerful. But I think there is this idea of story elements and actual stories can map together to be dialogically imposed with each other. I think they do that, like how the second Genesis account of, or maybe it's the third. No, it's the second one. The second Genesis account of Adam and Eve partaking in the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is directly imposed with the Greek tragedy of Pandora and her box. I'm 99% certain that I know for certain those two are, if you impose them beside each other and look at the story elements, they're identical. In the same way Dances with Wolves and Avatar are identical if you impose the story elements together. And why is that important? That just shows, again, that consciousness is about writing stories and mapping story elements together to get unique outcomes. I think that's one of the most powerful things consciousness can do. And that's one of the most important things I've done with my book, to overlap story elements together. And I think that the overlapping of specific story elements shows the almighty power of God. And when God said he made us in his image, this is one of those things where he gave us the power to do exactly what we're doing. So those are my thoughts for today. If you like this content, please like, share, comment. I know that's pretty generic for YouTube, but I would like to grow. So please share. I'd like to grow because I'd like people to be able to interact with the dialogue of existence.